Okay, thanks to Christine for an interesting talk and for helping me set the stage a little bit for my own talk. So I'm going to focus more on language, less on instrumental behavior or imitation as in the context of ritual, and more on the question of how children acquire new beliefs, new assumptions about what exists and what doesn't exist from their interactions with other people in the context of language. And I'm particularly interested in arguing that children rapidly have a sense of their own limited knowledge vis-a-vis a larger cultural knowledge and expertise with which they're surrounded in a conversational community. Hence my title, I Don't Know. The idea that it being that children are alert to their own ignorance, and this is an important stimulus for them to seek information, particularly information from allegedly better informed other people, typically by asking questions. So acknowledgements to various collaborators here, some at where I work at Harvard, also in China, Boston and Chicago. So here's a quick overview. I just want to give you some background with respect to the research on what I call testimony. And then I'll zoom in specifically to early signs of children's awareness of their ignorance, or at least expressions of ignorance. Then more verbally explicit indications that they don't know something. And that will lead me to a more theory of mind-ish emphasis on the extent to which children are developing an early concept of knowledge and the extent to which it is, in some sense, coming in earlier than some of the standard or classic claims in the theory of mind literature. And I'll talk briefly about the emergence of questions in early childhood and end with some new work that we're doing on individual differences in information seeking. Not just asking questions, but in particular doing little experiments to see whether what you've just been told actually pans out when you explore the world, whether the world fits what you've just been told. A kind of probe of children's empirical stance or scientific inclinations. Okay, so as Christine was emphasizing, children are gifted anthropologists in the sense that, just like anthropologists, they're born into this culture that they don't know anything about. They live within it, they acquire its language, they have various informants, and eventually they internalize the mores and assumptions of that particular culture. I want to emphasize that because I think too often in cognitive development at least, we thought of the child to some extent as a loner, a child who's a stubborn autodidact rather than somebody who looks to others for guidance. Now there's a lot to be said about children's autonomous cognitive capacities, and they do make sense of the physical world rather effectively with their own tools and their own cognition and their own information processing. But there's a lot of the world that they can't make sense of without others' help. In particular, when it comes to things that they can't observe, children, and can't do experiments on, children are deeply dependent on others' testimony. So let me just give you some quick examples. We can think about examples drawn from religion, from science, and from history. So young children will come to believe in an afterlife. Young children might come to believe in the existence of God or the ancestors. Now, presumably none of those things none of those beliefs are dependent upon first-hand experience. They rely on other people's testimony in order to establish beliefs in those spiritual or religious entities. If we think about science, 5- and 6-year-olds begin to understand that they have a brain, that their brain controls their thinking and other psychological processes. They come to believe in germs. 5- and 6-year-olds, it varies a little bit from one culture to another, begin to understand that the earth is round. In all of these cases, let's add dinosaurs as well, and possibly an insight into evolutionary processes in some simple fashion. All of those assumptions depend upon children learning from other people, simply because the evidence with which to build those theories and claims is not available to them. If you think about history, well, even to learn something about their own parents' past, to realize that they live in a certain community with the past, going further afield to learn about the history of their nation, a civil war, slavery, they're reliant on other people. So there's a sense in which children are operating in a world which is infused with the claims and testimony that's supplied by other people. And to be acculturated simply means to make a lot of tacit assumptions in line with the testimony that you've received. By the age of 3 or 4, we see that children, when listening to claims made by other people, are selective. They're not completely gullible or receptive. They prefer to seek information from certain people, certain informants, rather than others. So, for example, they prefer to ask questions of, and they're more likely to endorse information that comes from familiar people as opposed to strangers, from people who have some record of being knowledgeable and competent as opposed to ignorant, from people who belong to their own cultural group. Just to give you a quick example, children will learn more readily from, if they're American children, from an apparently native speaker of English than from somebody who speaks English perfectly competently and in an understandable way, but has a non-native accent. And last but not least, children are hypersensitive to the number of people who are agreeing with respect to a particular claim. They'll turn away from a dissident and they'll go more for an information claim offered by 3 or 4 people or a consensus. So those selection biases are evident by 3 or 4 years, and to some extent we can find some of them appearing even earlier. And this line of work is something that I reviewed 4 or 5 years ago in a book called Trusting What You're Told. But what I'm going to do this morning is to try to talk about some new directions that work has been taken. So one important direction is to think about infants and their sensitivity to learning from testimony. Now, I must admit, when I wrote the book in 2012, my assumption was that to the extent that testimony seems to be intimately connected with language and assertion, then it's plausible to start looking for learning via testimony among 3 and 4-year-olds. Having said that, in the last 4 or 5 years, a fair number of experiments have come out in which infants are either informants themselves, or they're given information, or perhaps even more dramatic, they're placed in the role of third-party bystanders, and they see an exchange between 2 people. When I say infants, I mean infants of around 12 to 18 months. What all of this evidence suggests is that in this early period, children are already have, in some sense, a working notion of testimony. They realize that information can be transmitted from this somewhat better informed person to this less well-informed or ignorant person. So, for example, if they have seen that, given the movements of these 2 people, one person knows where an object is, the other person doesn't know where an object is, and the first person points appropriately to update the second person, they will look in a surprised fashion if that second person doesn't look in the right place, but looks in some place where the object was at some earlier point in time. So in other words, infants are sensitive to the fact that somebody who's just received information will have changed their beliefs and will act upon it. And as I've just implied, children don't necessarily need to be active participants in those information exchanges. They can make sense of them as they watch them as third-party observers. And the same is true of children watching an information exchange that's in part consists of head nods or head shakes. If one adult informant asks if an object is here, and the second informant shakes his or her head, and then the first adult points to another box and says, is it here? And the second adult nods, then the child can make sense of that. They will search appropriately in the correct location. So in other words, the implication is that children bring to the task of learning language some deep insights into the function of testimonial transmission. Often in the study of language acquisition in young children, I think we've been bewitched by their syntactic competence, and to some extent we've underestimated and not really explored their major pragmatic competence, which antedates the more verbally specific, linguistically specific competence that we see among 2- and 3-year-olds. So the argument then is that infants come to language with the realization that individuals differ in what they know, and that, more specifically, an informed individual can offer testimony to a less informed or ignorant individual, and I should perhaps add, and that thereby informed individual will have changed his or her knowledge state and act accordingly. Okay, now I'm coming more specifically to the topic of ignorance, and we were inspired by a case study done by Linda Accredalo and Goodwin of a single child, Kate, whose gestures were followed in the second year of life. At about 15 months, Kate started to produce a don't know gesture, so she would do this kind of thing. I mean, I'm being a bit theatrical, but just to get it across. So the shoulders would lift and the hands would flip outward. So this gesture seemed to be in partial imitation of her parents. They would sometimes ask her questions, and they themselves demonstrated flips. Now, having said that, we decided, it was appropriate to be cautious about this particular child and this particular observation, partly because Accredalo herself has been particularly interested in the augmentation of children's communication abilities by the teaching of signs. So we didn't know whether this was likely to appear in other children or not. So we took a look with the help of Susan Golden Meadow and her colleagues at Chicago, who have a rich database of 64 children, video recorded every 4 months from 14 months upwards. This is a representative sample of the US. So we could plot the emergence of these flip gestures, and we did so from 14 months up through 42 months. So let me just give you an example of a flip gesture.
What's that? I don't know what that is.
So there's one. That's a 14-month-old. Here's another one.
Do you have a bear? No. You don't know?
I'll just do it again because it goes quite quickly.
Do you have a bear? No. You don't know?
Okay, so here's a look at the children. First of all, I'll show you a plot of the number of children who are producing this gesture from 14 months upward. Remember, we had 64 children, so we're asking what proportion of that 64. So here's the data. So this is just a crude measure of the flip gesture without probing too much about the nature of the flip gesture. And you can see that by, let's say, 2.5, we have 50 out of the 64 children producing that flip gesture. If we now narrow our criteria a little bit more and say, to what extent will the coders detect an I don't know flip, we lose some of those gestures, but still, as you can see, the gesture is widespread. Now it's interesting, as you saw, I think you heard in that second clip, the child not only did this, but muttered, I don't know, at least as far as one can hear. And here are data of the number of times the child produces explicit statements, I don't know. You can see then that the flip gesture is coming in earlier, but it's eventually overtaken by the explicit verbal statements. So to get a better sense of whether the child is really using this gesture to signal ignorance, it's worth probing the context in which the flip occurs a little bit more carefully. So we looked at the extent to which the child flipped when they had just been asked an information-seeking question, such as, where's the blue balloon, versus a question which in some sense invited them to do something rather than sought information. So the question was, what proportion of the flips could be deemed a genuine answer to an information-seeking question, and therefore an I don't know answer of the child's total number of flips? And here's the findings. You can see that at every age point, it's the information-seeking questions which are prompting more flipping than the non-information-seeking questions. So in other words, encouraging evidence that this really is a gesture that the child is using to signal ignorance. Okay, the next step was to ask questions about the extent to which we can produce this in a more experimental fashion. And so we designed a simple situation in which we could be fairly sure that the child would feel ignorant or uncertain versus a situation in which the child would feel fairly confident and informed. And we simply gave them pictures of objects to name. Some of the pictures were familiar, a book, a bird. Some of the pictures were unfamiliar, hardware items that the child would not have encountered. And children were simply asked to look at a given picture and to tell us what it was called. And what we were looking for then was some alertness on the part of the child to their own mental state of either ignorance or knowledge, and the extent to which they would volunteer the fact that they didn't know particular names. So just to give you an example, here's a book, a bird, and here's one of the unfamiliar hardware items. So we took various measures. First of all, obviously, the extent to which the child does name the item correctly, or conversely produces an incorrect name, and children were quite creative in naming the hardware items. The extent to which the child, as it were, signaled some kind of need for help by gazing at an adult, and more specifically, the final category, the extent to which the child expressed doubt or ignorance, either with a filled speech pause, an or an I don't know, or a question to the adult. So I'll show you the plot for familiar and unfamiliar pictures for these four categories of response. And as you can see, for the familiar pictures, we mostly get simply correct names, the occasional misnaming. For the unfamiliar pictures, on the other hand, we get a fair number of inventive children. They often invent a name, even though they don't know it. But in addition, they do seem to be sensitive to their own uncertainty or ignorance. They're more frequently looking at an adult, and they're more frequently expressing doubt in a vocal or verbal fashion. So let me give you a nice example of a child at 2 years, 8 months in this task.
Look at this. What is it? It's a book. Good job. What about this?
It's a bird.
It's a bird. Good job. And this?
It's a car.
It's a car. You're doing so well. What is this?
I don't know.
What about this?
It's pot.
It's a pot. What about this?
I don't know.
Good, good. What about this?
I don't know.
And this?
Shoe.
Shoe. And this?
It's a spoon.
Spoon.
Well, I think I've shown you enough to show that this child, at least, is perfectly capable of conveying that she doesn't know those unfamiliar pictures. Okay, so to summarize where we are at the moment, 1-year-olds can express ignorance non-verbally by means of this flip gesture. They typically produce those flips following an information-seeking question, and they're increasingly supplemented by verbal statements of ignorance. Now, parenthetically, it's worth pointing out that work with primates has suggested that primates can also monitor their own ignorance. So in tasks where they're forced to make a choice and the discrimination is titrated to the point where they become uncertain, the animal can be trained, so to speak, to hold off on a response so as to avoid some kind of loss or punishment. So there's a sense in which this capacity to monitor uncertainty is commensurate with what we see in non-human primates. But the important difference, of course, is that these children are communicating their ignorance to a partner. And that is not something, so far as I know, this is perhaps a discussion point that we see outside of the human species. So the communication of ignorance to a partner is distinctive. Okay. So the next question that I want to turn to is the extent to which children, given this fairly encouraging indication that they're capable of monitoring their own knowledge, can carry that further. So, can monitor their own ignorance, I should say. To what extent do they carry that further? For example, are they also conscious of the fact that they do know certain things? Or is it just in these states of uncertainty that we see them self-conscious? So that second question, do children comment on what they do know as well as on what they do not know? So that's question number one. The other question I think is important is, to what extent are these comments restricted to the self, and to what extent will they make them of an interlocutor? It's fair to say that in the theory of mind work, the working assumption has been that children are acquiring a person-neutral theory, a theory that's equally applicable to self and other. It's conceivable, however, in this case, that the insights that the children are showing are in some sense a part of first-person or privileged access to their own states and would not necessarily be extended to other people. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. It's also worth pointing out that if you look at the theory of mind literature, the standard view is that children are acquiring some sort of insight into knowledge versus ignorance considerably later than we might expect from the data I've just shown you. In other words, at around 3 or 4 years of age. So for example, in simple tasks where the child watches an adult either see an object hidden or not see an object hidden, at 3 or 4 years of age, children can discriminate and say that person knows where the object is or knows what's inside the box. That person does not know what's inside the box. So the seeing, knowing connection is allegedly established around 3 to 4 years of age in those explicit verbal tasks. If you look also at children's spontaneous language as analyzed by Karen Barsh and Henry Wellman, they concluded that, again, at 3 to 4 years of age, children are making distinctions between what they know and what somebody else knows. And they were reluctant to attribute any kind of insight into knowledge and ignorance below 3 years of age. So we'll look at some data, I think, which suggests we can be a bit more generous. Okay, so essentially we've done a study looking at 2-year-olds, 3 children, Adam, Sarah, and I'm going to call this child Q because her name is in Mandarin and I can't ever get it quite right, so I just call her Q. So Adam, a child first studied by Roger Brown, the pioneer of the study of children's language back in 1973. Another child, Sarah, again studied by Brown. And Q, who was the daughter of middle-class Mandarin-speaking parents from China. The mother came to work with me, and we looked back at this database from her recordings of her child. Okay. So in all 3 cases, we're talking about spontaneous language production. None of the 3 children was particularly precocious in their language development. So I think we can think of them as a reasonably representative in that respect. As you can see, they produced, during the period under study, different numbers of references to know, but they all produced enough for the purposes of analysis. The first question we asked was, well, are these no references merely echoic? Are they simply parroting without really fully understanding a caregiver's previous utterance? Or, alternatively, are they produced in some autonomous or spontaneous fashion without echoing the previous utterance from an interlocutor? Here are the findings. You can see that all 3 children often produce these no utterances autonomously or spontaneously. So the next question, we asked whose knowledge is the child talking about? I say knowledge, I sometimes mean not ignorance, of course, because the child is denying knowledge. The child could be restricting their comments to themselves. They could be also including an interlocutor. They could be talking about a third party. And of course, in analyzing the data, we sometimes couldn't decide who the child was talking about. What we found was that indeed there was a bias toward the self, but the child also talked relatively frequently about the interlocutor and very rarely about anybody outside of the conversation, a third party. Here are the findings. You can see that own knowledge dominates, but plenty of references to the interlocutor and next to none to a third party. And it's worth thinking about the fact that the large body of experimental work conducted in the theory of mind domain has essentially asked the child to think about a third party. So we may be seeing here some hints as to why we get a relatively slow timetable from that experimental work and a somewhat more accelerated timetable when we ask the child to think about self and interlocutor. The next step was to ask about the pragmatic function of these utterances. Was the child making an affirmation? I already know that. Was the child offering a denial? I don't know, or you don't know. Was the child asking a question? Don't you know that? And essentially we found that all three of those pragmatic functions were present, with denials especially frequent. The next step, though, which turned out to be, if anything, the most interesting move in the analysis, was to ask how often do children either produce affirmations or denials or questions with respect to the self, and how often with respect to their interlocutor. So let's take a look at affirmations first of all. So I'm simply showing you in this next slide how often the child makes a claim about the child's knowing or the interlocutor knowing. And you can see it's fairly divided. So the child often talks about you know that or I know this. On the other hand, when we look at denials, you can see that it shifts dramatically. The child next to never denies knowledge to the interlocutor, but is frequently denying knowledge to the self. As you saw in that video clip, the child says, I don't know, but the child does not say, you don't know. Finally, if we look at questions, it flips over completely. Questions are posed to the interlocutor about his or her knowledge. Questions are not posed to the self about the self's knowledge. So what do we conclude from this asymmetry? Well, before we go any further, we perhaps ought to take another look at some more data, but just as an interim comment then, children talk about the self and the interlocutor, but there's this asymmetry for denials and questions, with children often denying their own knowledge and not their interlocutors, and the reverse with respect to questions. We wanted to make sure of this asymmetry. I mean, we did have three somewhat divergent children from different family backgrounds and speaking two different languages, but we checked it out with 8 further children drawn from the CHILD-ES database, the one that Roger Brown started up or contributed to, with 8 children. So here's 8 children, and you can see for affirmations we get, again, this division between self and interlocutor. For denials, the vast majority pertain to the self, and for questions, almost all of them pertain to the interlocutor. Okay, so it's a very solid finding, and just to sum it up, the child seems to be thinking differently or monitoring differently the self as compared to the interlocutor. So what is going on? Well, I want to argue that 2-year-olds have a working concept of knowledge. They acknowledge their own ignorance, but they're reluctant to assert that their interlocutor is ignorant. And indeed, they inquire about their interlocutor's knowledge and never about their own. So the implication is that children, I mean, if we step back a moment, it looks as if children can sense that they don't know something, but equally they're open to or receptive to the possibility that their interlocutor might know something. And of course, if you have those two assumptions, it seems plausible, or it provides a kind of foundation for asking questions. If you're ignorant, but you suspect that your interlocutor knows something, it becomes reasonable to ask questions to rectify your ignorance. So that we can now turn to the next issue, which is, do children ask questions? We analyzed data from Adam and Sarah, and you can see that between 27 months and 36 months, somewhere between 10 and 17, 18% of the utterances are questions. So if you just count up the total number of utterances and ask what percentage are questions, what is equally interesting about these data is that line is, well, two things. First of all, the line is flat. It seems to be a very stable proportion during this third year of life. But equally, as you can see, there are these individual differences, which are also very stable. We don't know where those come from, but it may well be that it's, in some sense, nurtured by the kind of discourse style that the parent is displaying. There were already hints of that in Christine's data, if you notice that the American parents were differing from the Vanuatu parents in the number of questions that were being asked. And as Russell commented, it's almost certain to be the case that within the US culture, we're seeing differences in that probe. Okay. We can now ask, of those questions, what was their goal in asking a question? And again, in the case of the child's question, it could be to gather information from other people. Where are the scissors, where's the kitten, and so forth. It could also be that the child is seeking some kind of instrumental help, or permission, or making a request. Or it could be difficult for we coders to classify. Let's just look at what happens then if we look at Adam and we divide up his questions into those that are information seeking, those that are, so to speak, action seeking, and those that are difficult to classify. And you can see that his questions are dominated by information seeking questions. The same is true for Sarah, although it's a slower emergence in her case. And we made the same analysis for Q, and you can see that, again, it's a slower emergence. But essentially, by the end of the third year of life, all of these children are showing this dominance of information-seeking questions. Okay. So, to sum up, 2-year-olds ask plenty of questions. A lot of those questions are aimed at getting information, and that type of knowledge-seeking activity fits nicely with this metacognitive ability that I described earlier. Children's insight into their own ignorance, and their continuous monitoring of what they do and do not know, combined with an openness to information provided by other people and the possibility that other people will know what they do not know. I think it's very tempting to think that this is a uniquely human capacity, and we can talk more about that. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some recent research in which we're essentially trying to ask, well, how does the child fit together information that they receive from other people with their own first-hand observation? For the most part, we've been studying contexts, as I mentioned earlier, in which perhaps the child's sole source of information is other people. It's not as if the child can do independent analysis of germs or the afterlife or the Civil War. They're simply dependent on other people. But there are other occasions when, in principle, the child could investigate what they're told. So there's a background to this. Picture of Piaget and his compatriot Rousseau, and a nice quotation from Émile. As you can see, Rousseau is very skeptical about the idea of answering children's questions at all. The basic idea is that Émile should educate him or herself. I mean, essentially, Rousseau is ignoring all of the research that I've just reported. It doesn't fit into his theory. He assumes that indeed the child should be cognitively autonomous. The child as an anthropologist is not something he wants to buy into. Okay, so that's the background. So this study involved 5 Russian dolls painted over so that they were not so colorful. And as you can see, they differ in size. And Samuel Ronfar and Eva Chen tested children from 3 to 8 years of age. And they essentially started by saying to the children, which one do you think is the heaviest? And as you can see, not terribly surprisingly, the vast majority of children pointed to the biggest doll. In other words, they made the assumption that bigger means heavier. At this point, the experimenter did one of 2 things, either confirm what the child said or contradicted it. So in contradicting what the child had said, the experimenter might say, well, actually, that one is not the heaviest, and would point to the smallest one and say that's the heaviest. Or the other half of the children got confirmation, yes, the one you just identified is the heaviest, and this one here is the lightest. Well, you could probably guess what happens next. The experimenter has to go and answer a phone call, leaving the child alone with the opportunity to investigate whether this claim is true or false. And the children are recorded. Here are the data that we obtained. So look at those preschool children. It doesn't matter to them what they've been told. They do explore the dolls, but it doesn't seem any kind of empirical investigation into their relative weight. They're equally likely to explore the dolls if the experimenter confirmed what they said or countered it. But the elementary school children, you can see, are showing a difference. They're puzzled by this counterintuitive claim, and they go explore. If we use a more sensitive measure, how many children picked up the biggest and smallest dolls at exactly the same time and did a kind of comparison, you can see that the data are even clearer. I'll give you a quick example of each type of child. Here's a younger child. Well, I think you get the point. This child is not checking out that claim that the experimenter made. Here's an older child. Okay. So just to remind you, that's an example of the data pattern that we see here with those older children sensitive to this contradiction. The next step in the experiment, the phone call was over, the experimenter came back, and we were interested in the frequency with which the child would say to the experimenter, look it, I just checked this out and I think you made a mistake or whatever. Next to no children did that. We don't know yet. I mean, as you saw from the surroundings, these are children in China. We don't know whether this is an aspect of children's deference, something that American children might behave differently. So we would expect that perhaps far red bar to increase. In other words, broadly speaking, we would like in the future to investigate cultural differences in the relative weighting of one's own intuitions and one's own investigation vis-a-vis testimonial assertions. But that's for the future. So let me sum up. I'm going to skip that just to jump to the conclusions. So I want to argue that young children are metacognitive. They're aware of not knowing. We've seen that they express their ignorance in a variety of ways. At the same time, they're receptive to their interlocutor, perhaps overly receptive, as we saw in the final study. And a key aspect of this is the ability to ask questions. I should also emphasize, of course, that in the experiment you just saw, there were lots of children who did not systematically verify what they were told. They took it, presumably, on board. Let me stop. Thank you.